We are learning some stunning new details about the former president's attempt to overturn the 2020 election result, thanks to testimony from his former acting attorney general, Jeffrey Rosen. Rosen told the Senate Judiciary Committee over the weekend about efforts by his own deputy to enlist the DOJ in sowing doubt about the election results. Our next guest sat through Mr. Rosen's testimony and concluded that Trump's post-election efforts were, quote, leading up to a coup. Joining us now, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Democratic Senator from Illinois, Dick Durbin. Thank you so much for making some time for us, sir.
It's good to be with you.
I wonder if you can elaborate. I saw your interview with my friend Dana Bash, and, you know, we cover coup attempts in countries like Turkey. Would you describe it as a coup attempt?
Well, it's its own version, and I would say just look at the progression of events. First, the onslaught of lawsuits. Going through the judiciary with many of the judges that he'd appointed, he figured he'd find a friend and he would open up the conversation about there being some sort of fraudulent voter account in one of the states. Didn't work. Tried 50 or 60 times. Then he went to the Department of Justice, and he decided he would manipulate the Attorney General into really initiating an investigation into particular states. Jeffrey Rosen, I want to say in a positive reference to him, voluntarily came before our committee, was interviewed for 7 hours, and told us a lot of the story of what happened in that period of time. And I want to say, even though we were skeptical of Mr. Rosen going in, he stood his ground, and I'm glad he did. It was very important for our country. And then came finally January 6th, and we know what happened then. He turned the mob loose on the United States Capitol in an effort to subvert the constitutional process. So we shouldn't dismiss this as just a bad day for Donald Trump. It was a conscious, planned strategy that did not work, thank goodness. And the Constitution held, and we finally have the new president.
Senator, why do you think Mr. Rosen voluntarily provided you with 7 hours of testimony and didn't do so when the country went through a second impeachment trial of the ex-president?
I can't explain his motive or his decision in an earlier proceeding, but he could not have been more cooperative. He came to us voluntarily. There was no subpoena involved. Once the Attorney General made it clear that they were not going to assert any privilege in his testimony, he knew that he was not being held back, and he volunteered. And I think he was very cooperative from my point of view, start to finish.
Do you think, I mean, it sounds like he was happy to be there and very forthcoming. Do you think there was a threat that he faced? I mean, why do you think he didn't? I mean, you were a juror twice. The second time, it was a bipartisan impeachment vote, a bipartisan conviction vote. Do you think someone like him offering 7 hours of testimony to the United States Senate might have made a difference in terms of whether the ex-president was convicted the second time?
I'm not sure, because that really focused on the events of January 6th. And I thought they were so convincing, and even 6 or 7 Republicans agreed on the final vote. But what Mr. Rosen had to tell us preceded that event. It was the last week in December and the first week in January when the president was making his full play and threat to Mr. Rosen that we discussed in this investigation.
Do you see them as connected, or does he see them connected to January 6th?
I do, in terms of President Trump. I mean, he was trying every trick in the book. First the courts, then the Attorney General, and then the mob. I don't know what else he would have tried at that point, but he was trying everything he could think of. And Mr. Rosen fit into the second scenario where the president was virtually threatening to replace the Attorney General if he didn't do his bidding.
I wonder, I mean, we don't have a lot of examples of people inside Trump's deep inner circle cooperating with investigations, but one might be Mr. Mueller's use of Don McGahn, then the White House counsel. And it seems from reading the second volume of the Mueller report that Don McGahn maybe opened those investigators' eyes to other witnesses. Can you tell us what other witnesses you'd like to pursue after your 7 hours with Mr. Rosen on Saturday?
We have the U.S. Attorney from Atlanta, Georgia, who will be speaking to our investigative team, bipartisan investigative team, in a few days. And then there are others we're considering. Certainly, we'd like to have Jeffrey Clark do the same. There's no reason why he shouldn't. I hope he'll cooperate.
And are there other states that Mr. Rosen was concerned that the Clark model of asking Rosen and Donahue to send a letter to Georgia, asking them to have the legislature void Joe Biden's win there? Are there other states that are on your radar?
At this point, no. Georgia was the focal point, but we're not ruling out those possibilities. We'll look closely at the transcript and gather the information and evidence before we make a public report.
And from listening to Mr. Rosen's description of Mr. Clark's conduct, do you think it was criminal?
I'm not sure I want to characterize it one way or the other at this point. There's a lot of information we'd like to gather from Mr. Clark will help bring some clarity to the situation. But it certainly raised a question, and Mr. Rosen understood that Mr. Clark was waiting in the wings, and if he didn't do President Trump's request, comply with those requests, he very easily could have been replaced.
Does your committee's sort of investigative purview intersect with the 1-6 committee in mission or scope, and are you collaborating with them?
Not at this point, but I think clearly we're prepared to. There's no reason why we would not. We had a bipartisan effort in the interview. They have a bipartisan committee. I think if we have some information that we can share with them at some point, I wouldn't rule that out.
Do you have any sense, I mean, this is your expertise, and I think I spoke to you at various intervals over the last 5 years with varying degrees of alarm about what was happening at DOJ. Can you just characterize how you felt listening to the 7 hours of testimony and having that sort of real inside look at what was really happening?
Well, first you have to understand that Bill Barr has resigned at the point when we start our questioning of Mr. Rosen. Clark, who had done the president's bidding in almost every area, had decided that the election was honest, the results were fair and accurate, said as much publicly, and then quit. So at that point, we had a vacancy at the Department of Justice, and that's where Mr. Rosen came in. As I mentioned earlier, some of us were good at questioning. Is he up to the job? Can he stand up to this president, whatever the pressure may be? I wasn't sure. I would have to say, based on what we know now, he did stand up.
Would you like him to be more forceful in saying the things you just articulated? I mean, you've got the Trump base, it's shrinking, but you've still got the Trump base that believes in the big lie. The big lie was what Mr. Clark sought to corrupt the Justice Department with. Is there a sort of function in a public testimony down the road for Mr. Rosen?
I can't tell you whether there will be any public testimony. There will be a release, of course, of what we heard in the course of the investigation. And I think he was very factual, very forthcoming. I didn't believe he was evasive in any way. He really, despite not being under oath, I thought he was giving us a truthful account as he remembered it.
Did you plan to have him come back after you go speak to the U.S. Attorney from Georgia? I mean, do you plan to continue to rely on him as a fact witness, again, to use the Don McGahn parallel with Mr. Mueller? I think he spoke to him for more than 30 hours.
I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't rule it out. But I'd have to tell you that 7 hours is a very good indication of his cooperation, and we were grateful for it. If there's additional information necessary, we might request him to return.
You've been so generous with your time. I just have a question for you about whether or not you asked him about the reference in Mr. Donahue's notes about Donald Trump saying, "I'll take care of the rest after you declare the election corrupt, along with my R accomplices." Do you know who the R members of Congress are? Did you ask him?
I wasn't there for that particular question if it was asked, so I can't give you a good response.
Is it your sense, though, that there were Republicans who knew about Mr. Clark's efforts?
I don't know that. I would just have to tell you that there are aspects of the interview. I was out of the room some of the time and back in other parts of the time, so I don't want to characterize every question, whether it was asked or answered. But the 7 hours were carefully monitored by staff, Democrat and Republican staff. We're going through reviewing the transcript at this point.
And those notes seem to be accurate in terms of what you were able to pursue in those 7 hours. I wonder if you think Congress should and will get to the bottom of who at least Trump was referring to when he told Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue that if they could leave the rest to him and our accomplices, they would deal with the rest of it. Is that of interest to you? And is that something you'd like to get? Okay.
I can guess who his loyalists were at the time because I know who they are today. And there are quite a few of them. Let's be very honest about that. Some of them were outspoken. One or two appeared before the rally that he held near the White House lawn before he sent the mob to assault the Capitol. So it's not tough to identify his loyalists. They were pretty proud of that label.
And still are, It is very generous of you to spend so much time talking to us. I wonder if there's anything about it that I didn't ask you that you want to share with us as the last word.
No, but we're going to continue. We're not finished. And there'll be some other witnesses, and we'll request people to come join us and tell us their side of the story. I think it's going to be a fascinating report. Stay tuned.